Hello and welcome to the Pulse of the Indo-Pacific. This is the second edition of a new interview series we're doing here at Heritage with policymakers and policy shapers in the Indo-Pacific. For the second edition, I am excited to bring you a very special guest to speak about a very timely topic or series of topics. Lisa Curtis is currently the director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for New American Security. And prior to that, served on the National Security Council as Senior Director for South Asia from 2017 to 2021. While there, she was intimately involved in U.S. policy toward South and Central Asia. She had a front row seat, literally, to negotiations with the Taliban, and she was a key contributor to the Indo-Pacific Strategic Framework, among other things. Lisa has had 20 years of government service, including at the CIA, at the State Department, on Capitol Hill, and several years here at the Heritage Foundation, frankly, as my predecessor. For the first several years I was here, I was referred to as the new Lisa. And I think I'm still known as the new Lisa to some people in the building. So it's great to have you back again. It's great to chat with you today. There is, frankly, a lot of topics we could cover in South and Central Asia. We could do a whole program just on India. But given what's transpired in recent weeks, what's in the news, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't dive right into what's happening in Afghanistan. We've seen in recent weeks the rapid collapse of the government in Kabul, the announcement of a new Taliban government this week filled with hardliners. You had a front row seat to negotiations with the Taliban. I know you expressed some doubts from the very beginning that they were negotiating in good faith. Are you surprised by what you're seeing today? Was this avoidable? From somebody that was involved with the negotiations, how have you reacted to recent events and what we're seeing in Afghanistan?
Well, thank you, Jeff, and it's great to be here back at the Heritage Foundation. And I assure you that you're in much better shape than the old Lisa and can bench press a lot more than the old Lisa. But on Afghanistan, I am not surprised to see what's happening. Unfortunately, I think the current situation, the seeds of what we're seeing were sown in the previous administration with a poorly negotiated U.S. Taliban agreement. This is the Doha agreement that was signed in February 2020. And it did not demand enough from the Taliban. It did not demand that the Taliban break ties with al-Qaeda or eject al-Qaeda from Afghanistan. It also favored the Taliban in that it forced the Ghani government, the previous Ghani government, to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners from jail before the Taliban would even sit down for talks with the Afghan government. So basically, the Taliban were able to gain international legitimacy while they continued to fight their way back to power. And unfortunately, the government was undermined. The Afghan security forces were demoralized. And the Biden administration had the opportunity to back away from the Doha agreement and pursue a different path. But President Biden chose not to. And not only did he stick with this very weak Doha agreement, he abruptly withdrew all U.S. forces and very much mishandled how the withdrawal was done. The Biden administration withdrew 16,000 contractors all at once. At the same time, they were removing U.S. forces, taking away, all of the capabilities that the Afghan forces had relied on for so long. And I think the recent announcement of the interim government, the Taliban's interim government, which we were told would be an inclusive government that would include both moderates and others, is not so. It's a very hardline government. The leader is from the Taliban Old Guard. He held a position in the previous Taliban government in the 1990s, Sirajuddin Haqqani, the leader of the Haqqani Network, which is a State Department designated foreign terrorist organization responsible for some of the worst terrorist attacks in Afghanistan, including killing U.S. civilians. He's now the Interior Minister in charge of security of the country. So unfortunately, I think that we find ourselves in a very bad position in Afghanistan, and the country is poised to reemerge as a terrorist safe haven and to continue to threaten vital U.S. national security interests.
I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who thinks that the withdrawal was done effectively, or that the new government in Afghanistan now isn't really in any way desirable. But it seems now that much of the debate sort of focuses on what were our other options and whether or not we could have continued to keep a lid on things with a modest troop presence. And you do see many people arguing that we were down to 2,500 soldiers. The financial costs were coming down. The costs in life and treasure had been dropping for years, and that this was sustainable. And had we kept that troop presence there and continued backing the Afghan government, we wouldn't have the situation that we've seen in recent weeks. Others say that's not quite accurate. You would have needed to surge up troops significantly if it was seen, if America was seen as pulling away from the deal. I just wonder what you make of that debate. Were we at a sustainable place with our commitment, and could we have kept a lid on things with a modest troop presence?
I think it was absolutely sustainable to keep 2,500 U.S. troops in country. We know that the NATO countries would have kept an additional 7,000 to 8,000 troops in the country. So, they would have been there to support the U.S. mission. And I think when President Biden says he had only two choices, pull out completely or surge troops, that's a false choice. The U.S. could have protected, our fundamental counterterrorism interests by keeping a small presence. Now, there is risk entailed in that the Taliban may have started attacking U.S. forces again. As we know, the one thing we did get out of the Doha Agreement was the Taliban's pledge to not attack U.S. forces. They fully continued to attack the Afghans and also assassinate Afghan civilian leaders, but they did refrain from attacking U.S. forces. But, I talked to senior military officials in March before President Biden made the decision to withdraw fully. And what they told me is that they could deal with the risks, that they had capabilities. They weren't sitting ducks. If the Taliban were to try to attack U.S. forces again, they would have a way to respond, and they could manage the risks. And, what we see now are huge risks. So no option was risk-free. But I certainly believe it would have been a better option to keep a certain amount of U.S. forces there with our European partners. And if we were to withdraw, to do it at a much slower pace, a more gradual pace, because the way it was handled was like pulling the rug out from under the Afghans, and at the same time risking the lives of the U.S. citizens who were still there, some of which who are still in Afghanistan, as well as our Afghan allies. You have thousands of Afghans who supported our military efforts, worked as interpreters, supported our embassy efforts, and they're still stuck in Afghanistan. And I think it's the U.S. moral responsibility to make sure those Afghans can get out of the country and can be safely relocated after being fully vetted, of course, but then can be resettled in the United States. It's the least we can do after the support that we received from the Afghans over the past 20 years.
You talked a bit about the Haqqanis, and I'd invite you to speak even more about their relationship with the Taliban and how it does seem at every turn that they've been behind some of the worst attacks on U.S. forces in Afghanistan. They've also been identified by the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff as a veritable arm of the ISI. How is it that we have ostensibly a partner nation who is supporting the deadliest terrorist organization in the region, certainly as it regards American interests? How can we engage with a government that contains foreign terrorist elements, people with U.S. bounties on their head? And how should we view the relationship between the Haqqani network and the Taliban and the ISI? I think this has been a murky picture for some time.
Yeah, well, I'll just say that when I was at the Heritage Foundation in 2012, I testified before Congress that the Haqqani network should be designated a foreign terrorist organization. And indeed, about a month or two later, they were. So they have been designated a terrorist organization for the last 10 years, almost 10 years. And that is because they have had a role in some of the worst terrorist attacks in Afghanistan, including attacks that have killed and wounded U.S. soldiers as well as American civilians. So absolutely, that is the right designation for this very deadly group. With regard to their relationship to the Taliban, let's not forget Sirajuddin Haqqani has been the deputy Taliban leader. So they are completely integrated with the Taliban. They do have an independent strength, particularly in eastern Afghanistan, which is where the Haqqanis are from. And so they are distinct in that way, that they have a clan, they have a strength in that part of the country. But in terms of the influence and power, they are part of the governing structure of the Taliban. And so it's kind of a distinction without a difference when you're talking about the Haqqanis and the Taliban. So we really shouldn't make too much of their differences when they are part of the governing structure. They are consulted. Their viewpoints count when it comes to Taliban decision making. And you're absolutely right. They have a very close relationship with Pakistan's intelligence service, which goes back years. And so that is something also very concerning. The fact that the head of Pakistan's intelligence service, General Fez, was in Kabul as they were forming the government, the interim government, I think is a reason for concern. And it has caused a lot of Afghans to really feel uncomfortable that the Pakistanis are driving the direction of this new Taliban regime. So I think the U.S. needs to be very careful. And I was glad to see the Biden administration is not going to rush to recognize, to give international recognition to the Taliban, because the signs are not good. We have a lot of hardliners in place, a lot of people that have direct connections to terrorism. And so we absolutely should not be in any rush to recognize this government or to, unlock their assets or provide large-scale assistance.
Maybe just note that it was a senior Haqqani commander, I believe, that was put in charge of security in Kabul a week before this deadly suicide bombing attack on killing 13 U.S. soldiers and almost 200 Afghans. You spoke a little bit about Pakistan, but I know that before you went into government, while you were at Heritage, you were quite critical of the ISI, its support for the Taliban. You and Ambassador Haqqani wrote a piece at one time arguing for imposing greater costs on Pakistan and the ISI. For a long time, we were told that was not possible because while the double game was evident to everyone, we were very reliant on Pakistan for ground lines of communication into Afghanistan. We needed them to serve as a mediator and bring the Taliban to the negotiating table. This was sort of the reasons that were offered for why the United States couldn't take a more punitive approach. Have some of those barriers receded? Are there now less obstacles to a more conflictual relationship with Pakistan? Would you argue for taking a harder line now toward Islamabad? How do you see the U.S.-Pakistan relations evolving in this new environment?
Well, President Trump did suspend military assistance to Pakistan in January of 2018,
Yes.
some $2 billion in funds that were obligated for Pakistan's military. So I think that was an important step, because the U.S. taxpayer should not be funding a military that is supporting our enemies, that is supporting groups that are killing U.S. soldiers, which is essentially what was happening. So the Trump administration rightly cut the military assistance to Pakistan. However, Pakistan didn't really change its behavior. I think Pakistan is very attached to its relationship with the Taliban, because Pakistan assesses that that helps deny India strategic depth in Pakistan's backyard, which is Afghanistan. So unfortunately, even though that military assistance was cut, it did not change Pakistani behavior. But it also did not cause Pakistan to cut off those ground lines of communication, to cut off the airlines of communication and other things that we were relying on Pakistan for. So I think, you raised that everybody said, oh, you can't cut off the military assistance, it'll ruin the U.S.-Pakistan relationship. So we proved that that didn't happen.
Right.
But moving forward, look, I think it's too late to levy consequences on Pakistan, but we also can't ignore the fact that the Taliban would have never been able to come back in Afghanistan and be able to, fight for 20 years without having that Pakistani safe haven, without being able to fall back into Pakistan to rest, recuperate, regenerate, and then be allowed to cross back over at will into Afghanistan. And we should not forget that, because we spent a lot of blood and treasure, as you said, in Afghanistan. And we were not able to prevail largely because the Taliban enjoyed sanctuary inside Pakistan. And that should not be forgotten. I'm not saying that the U.S. should cut diplomatic relations with Pakistan, but I also hope that the Biden administration doesn't fall into the trap of thinking we need Pakistan's help, because we're not going to get it. We didn't get the cooperation we needed for 20 years. There's no reason we'll get it now that the Taliban is back in power in Afghanistan.
I guess the last question in this space would be, we've seen in recent weeks, particularly after the airport suicide bombing, discussion of ISIS and ISK in Afghanistan. Who are they? What's their relative strength? What's their relationship with the Haqqanis and the ISI? They seem to be rivals of the Afghan Taliban, but also may have links with the Haqqanis. How much of a threat are they to U.S. interests? Should the Taliban be viewed as a partner against them? Or is this a sort of distinction between good terrorists and bad terrorists? How do you see ISK as a phenomenon in AFPAC?
Well, I think it's a bit more complicated than that. Certainly, the Taliban and ISIS-K are rivals, but that doesn't mean that we should see the Taliban as partners in counterterrorism, because the Taliban is still closely aligned with Al-Qaeda and other groups that threaten the United States and other countries' interest in the region. ISIS-K, of course, came about around 2014, 2015. After the rise of ISIS in Iraq, they established the Khorasan branch. Khorasan refers to an Islamic reference to the region, to that region. And they have been extremely brutal in their attacks. They've gone after the Hazara minority. This is a Shia ethnic minority in Afghanistan. They have conducted several brutal attacks in Kabul, including attacking a maternity ward of a hospital, killing mothers and babies. So they're an extremely brutal, barbaric group. And they are a threat, obviously, to the United States' interests. They carried out the horrific bombing a couple of weeks ago that killed 13 of our brave service members, as well as 170 Afghans. So they are a group that we need to be concerned about and keep an eye on. But I don't think that means that we see the Taliban as counterterrorism partners, because the Taliban will continue to support terrorists that are aligned ideologically with it, like Al-Qaeda. So I think, one benefit could be if the Taliban do fight ISIS-K and reduce that threat, that global threat that they do pose. But certainly I don't think we should think of the Taliban as being partners in countering terrorists. That would be a mistake.
Well, I think we could maybe move to a topic that doesn't get much focus in Washington, a region of the world, and that is Central Asia. Corner of the world you got to work on at the NSC. Really, all your career, you focused on parts of Central Asia. Can you talk about how U.S. policy toward Central Asia evolved during the Trump administration? A new Central Asia strategy was revealed, and how are the Central Asians viewing events in Afghanistan now?
Well, I think the Trump administration did elevate Central Asia, and in particular, our relationships with Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. There were two very important visits, one by the former Kazakh president, Nazarbayev. He came to the White House in January 2018, and then the Uzbekistan president, Mirziyoyev, visited the White House in May of 2018. So we had two very important Central Asia visits early on in the administration. And we also developed a Central Asia strategy. There hadn't been an NSC-led sort of interagency strategy towards Central Asia since 2015. So it needed to be updated. It needed to account for some of the leadership changes that we had seen in Central Asia. In particular, the rise of Mirziyoyev, who came to power in 2016. And he had started to bring reforms to Uzbekistan. So we've seen labor reforms, education reforms, we've started to see some economic reforms, but really as a sort of reorienting toward the United States and an interest in, getting more U.S. investment. Because frankly, the Central Asians want choices. They don't want to be dependent on Russia. Russia, of course, will always have a great deal of influence. This is its backyard. But what the United States can do is support the sovereignty, independence of these nations and give them choices with regard to economic investment and trade relationships. And so I think we have seen an improvement in the U.S. bilateral relationships with these countries, particularly Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, but also our C5+1 engagement, which really encourages the 5 Central Asian nations, and plus Afghanistan, by the way. That's increasingly part of the effort to see these nations work together, to trade amongst themselves, to think of themselves as really a block of nations. We think, the more they cooperate and break down barriers between their countries, that will strengthen their own, each individual sovereignty and independence, and make them more resilient in the face of continuing Russian influence, as well as increasingly Chinese influence, particularly economic influence by China. Now, most of the Central Asian countries have bigger trade relations with China than they do Russia. So this isn't a region that the U.S. needs to remain engaged on, have a presence, nurture the relationships, the partnerships, continue to stand up for democracy and human rights, because of course Russia and China are not going to stand up for those values, but the U.S. can and should in this very important region. And now with Afghanistan falling to the Taliban, our counterterrorism partnerships are much more important with the Central Asian states, particularly countries that border Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. So hopefully the Biden administration will continue the policies that were started under the Trump administration to really elevate this region in our foreign policy.
And just to follow up on that quickly, the last time the Taliban were in power, we saw the resistance formed in the Panjshir with the Northern Alliance. They obviously had some links to the Central Asian countries. This time around, that doesn't seem to be the case. It's in part because the Panjshir resistance didn't have a land bridge to the Central Asian countries, it seems. Maybe in part because Russia now seems more interested in engaging with the Taliban, and maybe leaning on these countries not to provide overt support. We don't know, but do the Central Asian countries see a Taliban government as a threat to their interests? And can we expect greater counterterrorism cooperation with them?
So I think Tajikistan in particular does see the Taliban as a threat.
Mm-hmm.
President Rahman is very concerned about the rise of Islamist ideologies. And you could see that in their policies toward the Taliban. Tajikistan has been much more reticent to acknowledge, or accept the Taliban, and would be more inclined to support leaders like Amrullah Saleh, who's trying to make a stand in the Panjshir. So Tajikistan in particular is wary of the Taliban, and I think they are very open to more counterterrorism partnership with the United States. Now, of course, they have to be careful because Russia would not, ever want to see U.S. troops on the ground there. Russia has its own troops, is involved in training and exercises with the Tajiks. But the Tajiks are concerned about the Taliban, and I think that will encourage them to also reach out to the U.S. for counterterrorism partnership. Uzbekistan may be a little less worried about the Taliban. They have, made a lot of effort to engage with the Taliban over the last few years. But I think even the Uzbek government would be uncomfortable with the kind of interim government that is forming. I think the Uzbeks hoped for a more inclusive government that included leadership positions for some of the more moderate leaders. So I think the Uzbek government will also be concerned by such a heavy element of the Haqqani network being present in the interim government. So I think it's slightly different with each country. Turkmenistan, same thing. They have had relationships with the Taliban for a long time. So I think they feel relatively okay having a Taliban government, but they will also be very leery about any terrorist links that government will have, and they'll be worried about extremists coming across the border and playing a role in Turkmenistan. I think all the Central Asian states have concerns about the spread of terrorism from Afghanistan.
That's fair. Well, I think we have time for one more question, and maybe we could end on a more optimistic note. We have seen undeniable, really dramatic progress in India-U.S. relations now for 20 years, but I think the pace of progress accelerated even more during the Trump administration, particularly on strategic and defense ties. You've had a front row seat to this evolution since the turn of the century. I wonder if you could just offer a few remarks on how far we've come, what might be ahead, and how the Indians are viewing the situation in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I think when people go back and look at the Trump administration, its foreign policy, I think that what they'll see is the elevation of the U.S.-India relationship was really one of the highlights of the Trump foreign policy. And we really saw the relationship grow over the 4-year period, but in particular, the last, 18 months or so. This is when President Trump addressed a rally in Texas, the Howdy Modi event with Indian Prime Minister Modi. President Trump visited India, had a very successful visit to India. And then after the pandemic breakout in February of 2020, what we saw is the U.S. and India realized how interdependent their economies are. The U.S. relied on India back office operations for things like hospital billing and other operations, financial operations, and really needed to see these continue even when India went on lockdown. The US saw how reliant it was on Indian pharmaceuticals. And when those were threatened, there was a very important phone call between President Trump and Prime Minister Modi. And then with the India-China border crisis started heating up in about May of 2020, and of course escalated to the point of a clash between the two countries and 20 Indian soldiers losing their life in that clash. I think what we saw is the U.S. showed itself to be a reliable partner of India. The U.S. provided moral and material support to India. We expedited the delivery of MQ-9Bs for India. The U.S. expedited the delivery of winterized military gear so that India could keep its forces in the Himalayas throughout the winter. And I think India appreciated the support that the U.S. provided it in its time of crisis. And so this all culminated in really elevating the U.S.-India relationship and also the Quad engagement. This is U.S., India, Japan, and Australia. The security dialogue that had started to get off the ground really started to come into play in the fall of 2020. The foreign ministers met, for instance. And of course, the Biden administration has taken that to the next level, holding the first ever leaders level Quad meeting in March of 2021. But I do think that when we look back at the Trump foreign policy, the attention that was given to the building the U.S.-India relationship will be acknowledged as a great foreign policy success.
I think you're right. Lisa, I think we're out of time. This has been a stellar conversation. Thanks so much for surveying the region with us, and I'd love to have you back again soon sometime.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been great.
Thanks for watching the Heritage Foundation's YouTube channel. With more than 500,000 members, we are the nation's largest conservative research and education institution. We believe the principles and ideas of the American founding are worth conserving and renewing. Please help us further our mission by subscribing to this channel and sharing our videos with your family and friends.